Hello and welcome back to another installment here on Concept Apartment. I am Darren Bacon and I've organized this as a Let's Draw presentation going over my entire process from start to finish of an environment design sketch. I'll cover techniques, thought processes, and tools for creating images like this. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comment section below and I'll be sure to get back to them. If you like this content, please let me know. Hit subscribe, ring the bell icon so you don't miss any updates from me. Let's dive right in. These are the tools I'll be using. Starting out with the paint section, I've got a block-in brush. It's a base layer bold shape brush. The second brush I'm going to be using most of the time today is this Establishing 2 brush. It's initial direction abstract block-in, shape for back and mid-grounds. And finally, there's a third establishing brush that I use for organic type situations. I also include my pencil tools I use. I explain why I like to use them in the tutorial ahead, as well as the smudge brush tools, which I'll be using quite a bit of, as you will see. So yeah, thank you for joining me again here today on this environment design sketch demo. All the link to all these tools and the whole brush pack will be in the description below, so you can find it there if you'd like. This is the kind of work that I'm typically doing, in the office or in a professional setting to generate some quick ideas for environment designs. I haven't shared a lot of that in the past, so I thought I would do that today here, which what you're seeing. And the way I usually get started on this stuff is by using some of the brushes I included in this pack to generate, really kind of like happy accidents and interesting marks. As you can see, I'm really focused on blocking in like the shadow shapes right now, and I'm using these initial direction brushes to sort of get me a lot of interesting shapes. Just kind of thinking about shape. A lot of squinting at the canvas. You can see I'm flipping the canvas a lot. I'm zooming in and out as well, or like moving away from the monitor to like really kind of, push my head back and squint at the canvas to make sure everything's reading in a small thumbnail format. Another thing you can do is open up the navigator and use the navigator as like a little thumbnail preview to sort of see your overall shapes. That's really all my thought process going on right now. It's just kind of exploring. You can see I'm exploring a lot with this brush, trying to find what it is I'm going to be painting today. It's really cool to use a technique like this because you can find a lot of really economic ways to sort of imply detail. And it really saves you a lot of time in the end. It's all about indication. So relying on the tools to make the indication marks for you so that you don't have to sit there and think about what every little detail and surface is doing. Not only does it speed it up, but you just find really cool results that you probably wouldn't find in a normal scenario if you were just sitting down and drawing everything. I have 3 main brushes I'm using here to block in, and they all do kind of different things. One of them is more organic, and one of them I'm using to one of them is more for like a fill, and one of them is more organic, and the other is a bit more angular and sharp, which is what I'm using to block in the majority of what you're seeing here. All 3 will be available, so feel free to check them out. Outside of that, the other only real tools I generally use, and we'll go over it in here, is typically pushing around a lot of stuff with the smudge brush, and I'll use a pencil tool, usually just like our super simple round pencil tool or a rectangular pencil tool. I like the pencil tool because it's got a very sharp aliased edge, whereas if you were just used a round or a rectangular brush, it's just kind of a smooth result. And I really like the abrasive sharpness of the pencil tool. So I typically use that for pretty much anything if I'm just doing something basic like line work. So you can see now I've got started with the smudge brush. I'll paint something in, I'll smudge it around, and I'm using it there to stretch and pull some pixels up to create some interesting marks. It's always just about thinking about how I can make the most economic indication possible. I cropped the canvas here for a bit. I was thinking I was going to work the aspect ratio rectangularly. I do that sometimes if I'm posting something, if I'm just working on a sketch, then I'm like, oh, I'm just going to dump this on Instagram or something. Then I usually do try to work it in a square aspect ratio. Lasso tool is definitely your friend. I use it a ton. I had a really interesting bug a while back where I couldn't get the lasso tool to go in a straight line on like the alt click. It was crazy. And it's such a huge part of my workflow. I had to go through drastic measures to get it back. So yeah, definitely I'm using the lasso tool quite a bit, not just for like creating quick masks to paint in, but also to make selections, to copy merge selections and move around big chunks of the image. Like here you can see I'm just using it as a really quick masking tool. But I use it a ton. Huge user of that tool. So everything I'm doing right now is definitely in a perspective. It's not solved. So a lot of times I'll just try to get my indication in there, not really worrying too much about nailing the perspective, knowing that I'm going to kind of fix it later. I was going to say cheat, but I guess it's not really cheating, but I do plan on making it correct, or as correct as possible, but it's just not a huge deal for me right now. I really want to get some cool marks down, cool shapes, cool gestures, a neat idea, something that's compelling. I'm going to think about adding more narrative in a minute. Speaking of narrative, like one of the things that I think helps a lot, and I could have even done better on this piece, is including something that draws the viewer in. Like, so right now it's just an environment, a background. It's essentially like a background painting, something that this was a TV show or a film. It would be taking place in the background in front of some character interaction. And so I would think about how you can get something more compelling in there. Because as a viewer, a cool background is neat, but there's really nothing that like makes me want to stay and look at it or get kind of lost in the world. It doesn't really draw me in. I think there's certain artists that do a really good job of that. Like one example I always think about is like looking at like Ralph McQuarrie stuff, specifically on the Star Wars side. What was pretty neat is that some of the most compelling images anyways were usually like medium shots that had a big emphasis on characters. And the reason why I think they're so compelling, or why they are, I assume, is that as a viewer, we find the human stuff interesting, human interaction interesting. So we're going to be really compelled to see, oh, what are these characters doing? Are these guys, they're sitting in a trench, waiting for some Imperial walkers to walk by. So us as viewers, we just find it super compelling to see that stuff. So it's really important to put those aspects in your paintings, like have some sort of narrative happening in the foreground or the midground that really draws in the viewer. You can see that I don't typically, like in paintings like this, especially if I'm going on further along, I will go take the time to create a total mask for the background, because you can see I was kind of masking out with the lasso tool and painting shapes in the background. Sometimes I'll go so far as to creating a whole selection set, like a layer with a fill that is a painting just for the midground, background, and foreground, so that I can select from it. I won't go so far as to do that this time, just because it's a pretty simple image, but I do go so far as to do that occasionally, because it's so important to really separate the planes. And so here you can see I'm made a selection so that I can really separate the planes between that midground and background. And we want there to be a really clear distinction between midground and background and foreground. We just don't have it there yet. Yeah, and so a lot of this image is going to be me, I initially block things in, and now I'm definitely, I've got the block in done, or my initial sketch done, and I'm going to, there's going to be a chunk of time here where I'm doing nothing but fixing little details and cleaning up to make sense of that initial sketch. So let's just bear with me while we work through that. You can see that now I'm starting to block in some more interesting background shapes. Putting more structures in the background helps tie it together, right? So the midground and the background have a sort of like a visual interest connection point. So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm doing this. We have it in the foreground so far. We have the main, this, whatever the structure is, coming towards the camera. And so now we're just putting things in the background to help tie it all together. Still using my initial direction brush to really find some interesting shapes. And you can see that I'm not being afraid to just use the selection tool and grab things and transform them and compress them down. Because when I drew it, it wasn't quite what I had anticipated. Now I'm going to start to block in some more foreground elements. I think one thing that's, one approach that's neat to think about is kind of following the alla prima painters who would work really light to dark and background to foreground. So I think about painting the background in first almost. You want to, or when I'm working with an image, I'll typically, as you can see here, I'm starting to paint the foreground in, but I've already really established the background. So I kind of work background to foreground. I mean, I'm going to jump around in this image for sure, but that's definitely what I'm thinking about while I'm painting is painting back to front and light to dark. In a perfect world, I think I would be painting digitally just like I would traditionally. It's just that because the tools are so flexible, I don't always do it. So, but it's something that I think is super important to be aware of and think about. I think the image is more compelling to the viewer, so even if it's subconsciously, with a dark on light approach to the image. So when you can see it, when you see the final, you can see the artist has marked darker values on top of lighter values, especially in a really gestural sketch like this. I think it looks super cool. Yeah, so you can see still, I still need to solve some perspective, but I'm just painting away, having a good time. But I'm going to have to sort of solve that sooner than later and really start to fix it, because it's not egregious. It's definitely not perfect, but I'm still thinking about how I can block in some more interesting stuff. So I've expanded the canvas now. This is something that you shouldn't be afraid to do. Sometimes it's really easy to get locked in on a canvas, but if you feel like your composition is being constrained, just don't be afraid to really blow it up and try different things. You can always fix it. It's digital. It's not, the end of the world. And so one of the things I was doing is I made some space so that I could put in a foreground here. And this is getting back to that idea of having some personal connection point to the image to draw the viewer's eye in and draw the viewer in, just to kind of be like almost a stakeholder in what's going on in the action in the frame. Really gives us a narrative sort of anchor, I guess is probably the best way to put it. As you can see, like I still have quite a few issues, value range too. It's very much all in the middle range with values over the place, but I'm going to fix that later with a light and layer. And I just kind of know that. So I'm really kind of treating this almost like a marker sketch, but knowing that I'm going to be able to fix the values later. And you can see how easy just using the selection tool, like to fill in spots and this in the right kind of brush like I have here. It's really easy to add onto the canvas and then use the smudge tool to pull things in and out, and really kind of, you'd never even know that the canvas was smaller previously, and I was able to add in quite a bit of foreground. I'm just going to continue to pull, and right there I just did a quick copy merge and created a new layer with my selection and then stretched it out. That's another thing is you can see on the right, my layer management is not the most organized. I typically, the way I think about layers, especially in environment art like this, is I'm just creating new layers as I go. Whenever I need them for a layer, like here I'm using them for a lighten effect, but I'm just creating layers as I go, almost like a little insurance policy. So if I'm going to try something that's maybe a bit risky, then I create a new layer and try it out. And then if it works, then I can flatten it, because ultimately the image will get flattened down or into chunks. But if it doesn't work, I can just delete it and, try something else. But yeah, definitely one of the things I was struggling with for a long time was I would go along in a painting creating like 300 layers or something, or 500, some crazy layer, amount. And it's just it never really helped me out. I think it's almost just like a confidence thing or something. It's a crutch, having too many layers. So as you can see, I'm just sort of creating a new layer. But at a certain point, it just all becomes irrelevant. And like here, I'm just going to copy the whole background. And this is the bit I mean about keeping a selection for your background. I'm just going to copy the whole background and copy merge it and then transform it and crunch it down, distort it so that it sits lower in the image. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to create more of a larger sky shape. It was very redundant in a way, where the shapes were very similar and steppy. Trying to think about how I can make that background feel like a bit of a smaller shape and the middle ground feel a bit like the larger shape. Now I'm working on this is like a little rifle to put on the guy's backpack. So to start off, I just draw it in side view and then stretch it into perspective. And I've done it with a color dynamic brush. So when I adjust the levels, there's a lot of digital noise in there, which for me is fine. I like the extra grit it adds to the image. So I just left it there, and then I dumped it on the foreground character's backpack, like a back stow. I could have done a lot better organizing my layers here, but I'm just moving really quick. Trying to keep all the elements of my initial sketch to make this feel like it's really a fast gestural idea, which is what it is. And this is just sort of to get an idea down. This is the kind of image that could finish this in a morning or an afternoon. Probably something like come into the office and finish it up before work or before lunch, and get it in front of the stakeholders' eyes, and then take it from there. It would be something that you could just really quickly do to kind of build consensus and talk to folks and make sure you're on the right track. Or just do several different variations and have a sheet of them. And then it would give everyone involved a lot of different things to talk about and to, make plans for next steps. I'm still trying to add in detail. These foreground characters aren't super important, obviously, because like I was saying, this is an initial sketch more or less to get everyone on board. But I do think that having little elements like this, like I mentioned, really help bring in viewers and help sell the idea overall. So I think it's important and worth doing. But you don't have to kill yourself, nailing everything. It's really just about getting the idea across at this point for this type of project. So I'm just going to take a bit of time here and try to clean up the foreground interaction and separate the planes. It's really important that we separate these planes. So a quick airbrush does the trick. Could have used a gradient tool there. I could have done a better job and created a whole layer mask, but again, just moving super quick on this one, so wasn't too like hung up on layer tricks or anything like that. One of the nice things I like about working this way is even if we take this to final later or incorporated 3D or whatever, is some of these early marks that you're making with brushes like this, especially with a lot of initial direction, a lot of color dynamics, they just give you some really cool effects in the image, like marking strokes, and also that hue and value jitter from the color dynamics brush give you a lot of really nice noise that I think it's worth trying to preserve throughout the whole image. So you can see that in some of my work, where even in like a heavy quotes final image where there's 3D involved, really resolved components in the scene, I'll still do my best to try to keep some areas where it's really loose and gestural and containing some of that initial sketch look. And I even go so far as like taking some of these really far, and I'll try to preserve a very traditional look, just because it's something that I'm super into personally as an artist. So whenever I'm painting something, I'm usually thinking about how I can make it feel less like a digital piece that it is, and more like something that's done traditionally. Now I'm using really big gestural strokes on the foreground, trying to get these foreground rocks to really sit and feel like something established in a painting. And I'll come back to them as well. It's just, I'm just chipping away at this thing as I go. I'll lean back and squint at it and see that I need to add more detail in certain places, and I'll go add detail there, and then I'll move around to another part of the scene. So I'm usually just kind of moving around it, but not in any specific order, just kind of moving, I guess I'd say, moving around the image and trying to push things along in little bits in one area, then push things along in a little bit in another area, and just kind of go through the whole image like that until everything feels about the same fidelity and level of finish. So if I add more detail to the foreground now, then it sort of sets the tone for what I want the final image to look and feel like. So I have this very gestural, indicated foreground guy here walking down a hill towards his buddies. And so now I kind of, I have a target to hit for the rest of the image. I want the rest of the image to feel like it sits really well with this foreground character. And so he's going to be the kind of the key. This guy on the left will be the key stylistically for what the final image will resolve as. I want to make sure that everything fits together and feels the same level of detail. I try to use the same brush for the most part, or constrain myself to the use of brushes so that it all feels consistent, as if I had painted this with gouache or something. If you were doing it traditionally, you'd only use a constrained palette, a constrained set of brushes. And so that's kind of what the look we're going for here. So yeah, moving around the image, chipping away at it. There's it's just like slowly bringing fidelity here and there where I can, where it makes sense. Here I'm trying to find the right brush setting. You can see I'm really struggling to find the right color dynamics slider, and I finally found it where I was happy. Again, I'm indicating light direction, and I'm indicating some perspective, but it's all very gestural. The big point of this scene is to capture an essence and not really, be a tutorial on how to, draw perfect perspective or something. It's very loose and indicated. And I think in a way, if you even if you were to nail the perspective, I think I read or heard Sid Mead say this at one point, but it was something along the lines of if the perspective is too perfect, then it almost creates an uncanny valley effect where the viewer finds it unnatural or unappealing to look at. So in a way, if you have perspective errors, if they're not egregious, it can actually be like charming, or add some whimsy to the image and make it feel more fantastical because it's not perfect. So I don't stress out about it. I definitely try to make sure things are within reason, especially on this sort of thing, but I'm not going to stress out about it. If I really I would care if it was more of a final resolved painting, and the way I would handle that is I would likely build some of these structures in 3D, and then I would actually use the 3D to inform the perspective and the lighting, the materials, and then I would key the rest of the image off of the look I got from the renders there. So that's usually my approach there. So I'm still chipping away at the background. You can see I'm using the smudge tool, I'm using the brush tool. I'm trying to find interesting shapes. I'm trying to adjust the level of detail in the marks to help sell a ground plane and a perspective, even if it's just indicated. I'm going to continue to add some structure to the midground as if it's this, if all this is just some sort of base in the side of a glacier or on the moon or a Martian landscape. It's all really indicated. It could kind of go any way depending on what color palette we choose. Thinking about directionality too in marks is pretty cool. Like especially, we're trying to draw the viewer's eye a certain direction, and so you can actually go so far as to use the marks you put down and the smudges that you put down to kind of guide the viewer's eye in a way like an arrow. So I definitely am thinking about that a lot as I go. And also, like, you can see there's horizontal diagonal lines behind vertical lines in the midground. And anytime you can create contrast like that, it helps sell depth. So whether it be, if it was an illustrated painting and you had a really sharp edge midground or sharp edge foreground, and then you had a really soft edge directly behind it, it would, even if it was something like, I don't know, like a grassy hill or something, the contrast between the soft edge and the sharp midground or foreground would really help sell depth. And likewise, if you have horizontal marks and then you have directly behind it you have if you have vertical marks and directly behind it you have horizontal marks, that contrast will, it tells our brains, hey, there's depth here, there's something going on, especially if you are careful with how you put down, when you lay down the value. If you do it in a way where you can hint at surface change, it would really help sell depth. So I'm still thinking about how to do that here, which is using the smudge tool and pushing around large chunks of pixels behind this main central structure to really help pop the central structure and make it feel like it's sticking out, not even close to the same plane as what's behind it. Overall, the image I think is starting to get there, so I'm going to start trying to tweak things into perspective, and you'll see I do that just by grabbing a big chunk of the midground. This is what I mean about not being scared about flattening your image. Just copy merge big chunks of it and paste them down and then move it around. You can always adjust things later. And I find that usually in my paintings, it like this, it'll get flattened 2 or 3 times before I go through and kind of make the final adjustments later on. And you can always reseparate it back into different layers like foreground, midground, background. So just don't be afraid to flatten it. And I'm going to do that several times here as I lay a perspective grid, and then just grab huge chunks of the painting and start to stretch it and make it feel like it's all into the right perspective. All right, so just still, noodling in detail now, just trying to make sure everything sits in a good spot. Trying out different things like how the structure interacts with the surface beneath it. Everything I try ultimately I don't really like, and so I go for a more indicated approach. So I rely on that brush to give me some really some happy accidents that I can live with. So I'm just going to make a selection and kind of paint in there and try to find the right look. But also, as you can see, the brush strokes, I have an angle to, I'm relying on that direction to point the viewer back to the left of the image as the eye guides around in a circle, in a clockwise circle. So the brush strokes are actually acting like a indicator to kind of pull the eye around. Still tweaking the foreground, making sure everything sits together nicely. These are just more or less the final adjustments of my sketch. I have everything really where I want it. So now it's just a matter of tweaking everything, getting everything to kind of fit and feel like it is cohesive throughout the whole image. Once I'm happy with where everything is, then I just sort of, again, start in the back of the image and kind of pull my way forward to make sure things make sense and find ways to create depth. A lot of depth can be created by going dark light, dark light, dark light. So you can see on the left here, it's very much that pattern where it's dark light. And every time you do that, it helps create, not only is there like a rhythm involved, but it also just creates a lot more depth. And it really helps, especially when you get your value structure correct. So yeah, now I'm just using some guides to drop in a perspective grid. You can see I've figured out I want my horizon line to be right about there. And so I set everything up, and now I can do a really quick perspective pass to make sure that things make sense on the grid. You can see again, I'm just grabbing a big chunk of the painting in a copy merged layer and then using the free transform tool to pull it into perspective. More of that, more tweaking things. You can see it's nice because if you paint in some really indicated brush strokes and then you just create a copy merged selection of that, then you get to preserve all that cool happy accident brush marking and just kind of stretch it into perspective and not have to worry too much about making everything perfect. Because the second that if I were to stop and try to go in and really nail everything on these surfaces, my painting time would go from a few hours to a few days. It just, as soon as you start to add detail in one spot of the painting, then you need to make everything feel cohesive and sit together, then you need to go around the entire image and make sure things match kind of aesthetically. And if that were to happen, you just open the door to hours and hours and hours of rendering. So again, that's why I was using those foreground characters to sort of key off of, or this is how loose and gestural I want the painting to be. And then I'm going to let the rest of the image kind of fall in line. So that's okay. Then I know it can be really loose and gestural in other places. And even like right now in the orientation where the canvas is, where the foreground, the most extreme foreground character is on the right. And then on the left, you have the third character. The third character is incredibly indicated. It's just a few brush strokes, and it doesn't matter because our eye is not going there. In fact, it helps the image. It helps the composition if there isn't too much information on that character. If I had overly rendered it, or if I had rendered it even to match the same fidelity as the extreme foreground character, then it would really draw my attention there as a viewer, and I don't want that. I want the viewer to see the foreground character and their brain to go, okay, got it. That's a foreground person there, and it looks like that person's with two other like team members, but it doesn't really need to be. They don't need to be nailed because I want the eye to kind of almost brush over it, fall over it. I want the eye to immediately go to that structure right behind the third character's head where it's another loose indicated shape. I want to guide your eye around the image. And if I have a ton of detail on that character, your eye is gonna get stuck there. And that's not what's important. We want the eye to move around the painting in a very fluid, dynamic way. And so it's almost like by creating it really loose and gestural there, it allows the viewer's eye to continue to move in a way that is compelling, and it just makes the image stronger, makes the composition stronger. Now I have things kind of in the perspective I'm happy with. Now I'm going to use the wand selection tool to grab things in the background and make sure they sit on the right value. You can see here I'm just going to lower the value on certain areas to help create planes. Readable planes is really important to help still depth. It's making sure the value arrangement is all there is really important. Adding a little detail to slow down the eye in certain areas where things are too simple. Helping make sense of some more of the perspective structures in the foreground will help sell this as a believable scene. Anytime things are too simple and the eye moves past them too easily, then I'm going to add a little more detail there to help slow the eye down. Again, making sure the perspective is working, adding in detail where it makes sense. You'll see that I turned the layers off that I've been working on here and there just so that I can make sure that my adjustments in my work that I've done is going in the right direction and actually working in an improvement, and I don't need to abandon it. Repeating some of this background element in the foreground, well, it's a midground element more in the foreground, just to help sell depth and to make the whole image more cohesive and feel like it's, some repeated structure. Again, just working more about cleaning up the planes, making sure that planes are readable and the depth is working. Adding in some quick indicated detail to help make the scale feel larger and more believable, more in perspective. Using the lasso tool is definitely really a powerful selection tool, or any like group selection set like that, like if it's color range or lasso tool, something to grab like a big area and then paint into it. You'll get to keep some cool brush strokes in there and some cool brush jitter, but you'll also get to solve things in a big shape sort of way and less on a micro paintbrushy way. Here I am just quickly trying to find ways to indicate in correct perspective. Again, I'm not interested in trying to make the perspective perfect. I just really want it to be indicated and feel right, good enough. Nothing about this painting is going to be perfect. I again have gone in to push a gradient to create more depth in the foreground and middle ground using the airbrush. That's definitely one of the things I'm going to be doing, going forward, is like, how do you really make sure the planes differentiate in a powerful way? If you're using color, it's even easier because you can use contrasting colors, or you can change the intensity of the saturation or, like hue, like mentioned. Now I'm realizing that the left side of my painting is a bit out of perspective compared to my right. So just really, really, incredibly basic stuff, just using a smudge brush to fix it. I'm not worried about making things perfectly mirrored or anything. I'm just trying to indicate that could be believable. It's almost like the more indicated it is, the better off I am, because if I try to solve something right now, I'm going to really slow myself down. And I'm just trying to make sure that all my adjustments make sense. And so I got to use the selection tool and move things around. I've pretty much moved into a lot of smudging here. It's predominantly all smudge brush. I've got different smudge brushes, like I said, for doing different sorts of things, but this is the most basic approach, where it's just pushing pixels around to really kind of find some neat, little neat markings here and there. And I like the approach, I like the result it gets of using this approach. So now I'm just trying to establish some depth using perspective with some quick shapes that establish a 1-point perspective. I'm going to go in and make more sense of this wall over here. Yeah, so really basic stuff. This is pretty much the final result here is what you're looking at. There'll be a few more little adjustments here and there, but right now I'm just kind of trying to get the piece into a place where I'm happy with it and it's looking good enough. The whole thing is an indicated sketch to sort of sell an idea, and I'm going to lasso out the background one more time, try to create some more depth with the lighten layer, and then I'm going to call it good. This has been a demo of what I would do to establish a really quick gestural sketch of an environment that I would then take to stakeholders, whether it be art director, creative director, leads of the team, and say, try to get consensus and say, should we go this approach? And then if that's the case, then either goes to 3D, or I myself start mocking it up and create a more resolved painting. And yeah. And here's the finished painting. I enjoyed sketching this. I hope you got something out of it. And take a look at my website, darrenbacon.com/FAQ for more info, and visit me on social with the links provided. Yeah, I'm Darren Bacon from Concept Department. See you next time.